Picture this. A man kneels in the dust of a training yard, iron collar cutting into the infected sores around his throat. The sun beats down on Capua like a punishment. Somewhere behind him, a whip cracks against bare skin. Not his, not yet. And the wet sound of split flesh mingles with a scream that stops too suddenly. The air smells of blood and human waste and the cheap olive oil they use to make gladiators' bodies gleam for the crowds. His knees press into ground that has absorbed the sweat and blood of 10,000 men who came before him. Men who are all dead now. He doesn't know their names. Soon, no one will know his. The guards speak about him in Latin he's learned to understand but pretends he cannot. They call him Thracian like it's a slur. They call him animal. They debate whether he'll last 3 fights or 4 before some merchant's son pays to watch him gutted for afternoon entertainment. They've made this calculation before. They're usually right. Around him, 70 other men shuffle through the same routine. They eat the same barley mush that keeps muscles alive but spirits crushed. They sleep in the same stone cells that flood with rainwater and rats. They train with wooden swords against each other, learning to kill efficiently, to die spectacularly, to make their deaths profitable for the man who owns their bodies. His name is Spartacus. He was a soldier once. Some accounts say he served in the Roman auxiliary forces before deserting. Others claim he was captured in the wars that ground Thrace into submission. The truth has been buried beneath 2,000 years of legend and propaganda. What matters is simpler and more brutal. He was sold, tagged, shipped south to the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, one of the most prestigious gladiator schools in the Republic, where men learn to transform violence into theatre and death into profit. He was supposed to die in the arena, torn apart by wild animals perhaps, or matched against a better-fed opponent in some provincial amphitheatre, while merchants ate figs and complained about the heat. His blood would stain the sand for an afternoon. Slaves would rake it smooth. By evening, no trace of him would remain. That was the plan. But something goes wrong in Capua in the summer of 73 BCE. Something that will metastasize from a kitchen brawl into a wound the Roman Republic will spend 2 years trying to cauterize. Something that will kill over 100,000 people before it ends. Historians still debate whether Spartacus intended revolution or simply survival, whether the revolt was planned for months or erupted spontaneously when the moment presented itself, whether he was a military genius or merely lucky enough to face Roman incompetence at exactly the right moment. The sources we have, Plutarch, Appian, Florus, wrote generations after the events, working from accounts that no longer survive. They contradict each other on dates, numbers, motivations. They agree on almost nothing except this: 70 gladiators armed with kitchen implements should not have threatened the greatest military power the ancient world had ever known. And yet they did. The revolt begins with a rumour. Someone has informed Batiatus that his gladiators are planning something. The details are unclear. An escape attempt perhaps, or merely collective disobedience. Batiatus responds the way any sensible businessman would. He plans to sell the troublemakers south to the mines, where they'll die slower and less profitably, or simply execute them as examples. The gladiators learn of this. They have hours, perhaps less. What happens next will reshape the Roman Republic's understanding of the humans it has classified as property. It will force 8 legions into the field. It will crucify 6,000 men along 300 miles of Roman highway. It begins with a choice made in absolute desperation by men who have nothing left to lose. How does a slave become a general? How do 70 men hold off an empire? And what breaks first, the rebellion or the man who leads it? The smell hit you before you saw anything. Rancid sweat baked into stone walls that never fully dried. The copper salt tang of old blood that no amount of sand could absorb. Underneath it all, the sour rot of infected wounds going septic in men who wouldn't receive treatment, because replacing a gladiator cost less than healing one. Spartacus breathed this air every day for months, maybe years. The sources don't agree on how long he trained at Batiatus's ludus before the revolt. Long enough to learn the rhythms of institutional cruelty. Long enough to watch men arrive terrified and leave dead or broken beyond recognition. The ludus operated on a simple economic principle. Gladiators were investments, not people, investments. Batiatus had purchased each man at auction, paid for their food and housing and training, and expected returns in the arena. The math was brutal. A skilled gladiator might fight 15 or 20 times before dying. Each bout generated revenue from ticket sales, betting, and the prestige of hosting memorable deaths. The goal was to maximise fights per gladiator while minimising costs. This meant keeping men alive but not comfortable, strong but not proud, skilled but not hopeful. The training regimen served dual purposes. Obviously, gladiators needed to fight well, audiences paid for spectacle, and a clumsy death bored the crowd. But the training also functioned as systematic psychological destruction. Men drilled from dawn until their muscles seized. They ate bland food in measured portions. They slept in cells locked from outside. They were forbidden to speak their native languages, to practice their religions, to maintain any connection to the identities they'd carried before the auction block. The message was constant. You are not a person anymore, you are a commodity that bleeds. Spartacus absorbed this education in ways his captors didn't intend. He watched the guards, their schedules, their weaknesses, the contempt that made them careless. He noted which gladiators harboured fury beneath their compliance, and which had been broken completely. He learned Latin well enough to eavesdrop while pretending ignorance. He studied the layout of the compound, the location of weapons, the timing of deliveries. Most importantly, he understood the gladiators' unique position in Roman society. Unlike field slaves or mine workers, gladiators received combat training. They built muscle specifically for violence. They learned to read opponents, to exploit weaknesses, to survive when survival meant killing. Rome was creating warriors from its human property. Warriors kept docile only by chains and walls, and the hopelessness that infected everything. Remove the hopelessness, and you had an army. Historians still debate whether Spartacus consciously planned revolution during these months of observation. Some suggest he simply catalogued information without specific intent, a survival habit from his years as a soldier. Others argue he was building a network of trusted conspirators from the beginning, identifying gladiators like Crixus the Gaul and Oenomaus, both mentioned in ancient sources as leaders, who might fight beside him when the moment came. The truth probably lies somewhere messier. Spartacus wasn't a prophet. He was a man trying not to die in a place designed to kill him entertainingly. The planning and the desperation were likely inseparable, each feeding the other as conditions in the ludus deteriorated. Because conditions did deteriorate. Batiatus had purchased too many gladiators, oversaturating his facility. Food rations shrank. Training became more violent as instructors competed for Batiatus's approval. Men died in practice bouts that were supposed to be non-lethal. Accidents officially, though everyone understood the economics of reducing inventory. The gladiators slept in tighter quarters. They trained with duller weapons. They watched friends die of infections that a free physician could have cured in days. The psychological pressure that kept them compliant began working in reverse, welding individual resentments into collective rage. Spartacus found allies in this pressure cooker. Crixus shared his cell block, a Gallic warrior captured in Rome's northern campaigns, massive and scarred and burning with hatred for everything Roman. Oenomaus commanded respect among the German gladiators, men from tribes Rome had not yet conquered, but was already feeding into the slave markets. Others joined whose names history didn't preserve, Thracians who remembered Spartacus from before, Gauls who followed Crixus, men from Africa and Syria and the Greek East who had nothing in common except chains. They began talking, carefully in stolen moments between drills, fragments of plans passed in glances and coded gestures. The conversations were dangerous, informers were everywhere, and Batiatus rewarded betrayal with privileges. But the gladiators found ways, they had nothing else. The problem was weapons. Gladiators trained with wooden swords. Real weapons stayed locked in the armory under constant guard. Any escape attempt would require fighting through trained security with bare hands and whatever improvised tools they could scavenge. Unless they found another way. The kitchens used knives, cleavers for butchering meat, spits and skewers sharp enough to pierce muscle. The cooks were slaves too, working adjacent to the gladiator barracks, handling implements that could kill if wielded with sufficient desperation. The plan crystallized around this realization. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even particularly likely to succeed. But it was possible, and possible was more than they'd had before. Then someone talked. One of the conspirators, the sources don't identify who, leaked information to Gladiators. The owner learned that his property was planning to escape. His response sealed his fate and theirs. The betrayal accelerated everything. Spartacus had planned for weeks, maybe months. Now he had hours. Gladiators moved fast when he learned of the conspiracy. Guards received new orders. The armory security doubled. Arrangements began for transferring the suspected ringleaders. The sources suggest Spartacus, Crixus and Onamaeus were all identified, to facilities where they'd cause less trouble. The mines, probably. Or a quick execution presented as an accident. Slaveholders had options when their property became inconvenient. The conspirators faced annihilation. Their network had been compromised. Their timeline had collapsed. The careful plan they'd been building dissolved into one terrible question. Act now or die waiting. They chose now. About 200 gladiators were involved in the conspiracy, according to Plutarch. Only 70 made it out. The math tells its own story. The escape was chaos, improvised violence erupting before most participants even knew it had started. It began in the kitchen area. The details are murky, but the ancient sources agree on the essential sequence. Gladiators overwhelmed the cook staff, seized whatever cutting implements they could grab, and turned on the guards before an organised response could form. Picture the first moments. A cleaver buries itself in a guard's neck, the wet crunch of cartilage giving way. Blood sprays across whitewashed walls. Someone screams an alarm that comes too late. More gladiators surge through doorways, snatching knives and spits and iron skewers, anything with an edge or a point. The guards are trained but surprised, outnumbered in the initial rush, going down beneath men who've spent months learning exactly how to kill quickly. The sound would have been horrific. Metal on bone, bodies hitting stone floors, the animal howling of men who've been caged too long finally releasing everything they've stored. Spartacus fought through the compound toward the armory. This was the critical objective. Real weapons meant survival, meant the possibility of fighting past the outer walls into open country. Kitchen knives could kill guards. They couldn't hold off a Roman military response. Historians still debate whether the armory seizure was planned or opportunistic. Some accounts suggest the gladiators knew exactly where to strike. Others describe a frantic scramble through unfamiliar corridors, following the sounds of fighting toward whatever weapons they could find. The truth matters less than the result. The gladiators broke into the armory and armed themselves with the swords and shields they'd trained with for months. Now they were dangerous. The escape from the Ludus compound left bodies scattered through corridors and courtyards. Guards who tormented these men for months died under their weapons. Administrators, trainers, anyone who tried to stop the tide. The gladiators showed no mercy because they'd received none. This wasn't justice. It was survival expressing itself through violence without restraint. Not everyone made it. The sources indicate that many conspirators were trapped inside when Gladiatus's remaining security sealed sections of the compound. Some were killed immediately. Others would face crucifixion in the aftermath, examples made of men who dared to resist. The 70 who escaped left behind comrades who'd die slowly for the crime of wanting freedom. Outside the walls, the survivors faced new problems. They were escaped slaves in a Roman province, visibly marked, easily identified, surrounded by a civilian population that would inform on them for the reward money. They had weapons, but no food, no shelter, no plan beyond getting away from Capua before pursuit organised. Someone, probably Spartacus, given his military experience, made the critical decision: head for Mount Vesuvius. The volcano dominated the landscape south of Capua, its slopes thick with vegetation, its terrain difficult for pursuers unfamiliar with the paths. It wasn't a destination. It was a hiding place, somewhere to regroup and figure out what came next. The gladiators moved fast through the summer darkness. Behind them, Capua erupted into alarm. Batiatus was screaming for soldiers. Messengers raced toward local authorities. Word would reach Rome within days, maybe hours, and then the full weight of the Republic would turn toward hunting them down. They had no illusions. Rome didn't negotiate with escaped slaves. Rome didn't offer terms. Rome crucified runaways along the roads as warnings to others considering the same choice. The 70 men climbing Vesuvius that night knew exactly what awaited them if captured. But something unexpected happened as they climbed. Other slaves found them. Field workers from the agricultural estates surrounding Capua, men and women who'd heard rumours of the escape and followed the noise and the fires. They came with nothing. No weapons, no training, no military value whatsoever. They came because the alternative was returning to bondage. By the time the gladiators reached Vesuvius's upper slopes, they numbered over 100. By the next morning, more had arrived. The rebellion was growing before Spartacus had decided whether he wanted one. On the volcanic mountain, overlooking the Bay of Naples, the gladiators caught their breath and counted their weapons. They'd done the impossible, escaped a fortified compound armed with kitchen implements, and walked away alive. 70 men had humiliated the Roman slave system. But survival and victory weren't the same thing. Rome was coming. The only question was how many legions it would take. The answer, when it came, would stun everyone. The crater of Vesuvius offered something the gladiators hadn't tasted in years: time. The volcano's upper slopes were nearly impassable for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Dense vegetation choked the paths. Steep ravines cut across approach routes. The single viable trail to the summit could be held by a handful of determined men against a force many times their size. For the first time since the escape, Spartacus could think beyond the next hour. Below, the Roman response was organising. Local authorities dispatched militia units to establish a perimeter around the mountain's base. The strategy was obvious: contain the escapees, wait for them to starve or descend, then capture or kill them at leisure. Rome had suppressed slave uprisings before. This one would end the same way. Except the slaves kept coming. Every day brought new arrivals to Vesuvius. Runaways from the farms and estates that quilted Campania. Domestic slaves who'd fled urban households. Workers from the ports and workshops who'd heard whispers of armed men hiding in the mountains. They climbed through the night, following rumours, risking crucifixion for the chance to join something that felt like hope. Spartacus faced his first impossible choice. The gladiators were trained fighters, 70 men capable of coordinated violence. The refugees were nothing: farmers, house servants, labourers whose only combat experience was being beaten. They slowed movement. They consumed resources. They transformed a military unit into a refugee camp. But turning them away meant sending them back to slavery or death, and the numbers kept growing. Within weeks, the camp on Vesuvius held nearly 3,000 people. Historians still debate whether Spartacus welcomed this growth or merely accepted it. Some sources portray him as a reluctant revolutionary, a soldier who wanted only to escape but found himself leading a mass movement he never intended. Others suggest he recognised the strategic value of numbers. More bodies meant more fighters, once trained, and more mouths to feed meant more desperate courage in battle. The truth probably contained both. Spartacus was a pragmatist trapped in circumstances that demanded ideology. He couldn't return 3,000 people to slavery. He couldn't feed 3,000 people on a volcanic mountain. He had to act, one direction or another, before starvation made the decision for him. The Romans solved his dilemma through arrogance. Rome sent a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber with 3,000 militia to eliminate the rebellion. These weren't legionaries. Rome's professional soldiers were committed to wars in Spain and against Mithridates in the east. They were hastily assembled troops drawn from local populations, poorly trained, equipped with whatever weapons the state armories could spare. Glaber expected to crush escaped slaves. He didn't expect a battle. His strategy was sound in principle: block the single path down Vesuvius. Wait. The rebels would surrender or die of thirst. Simple mathematics. 3,000 armed men surrounding a mountain full of starving fugitives. The mathematics ignored everything that made Spartacus dangerous. The gladiator leader studied Glaber's dispositions from the crater rim. He watched the Romans establish their camp at the path's base, watched them settle into the comfortable routine of a siege they believed already won. They posted sentries, but not seriously. They drank wine shipped from Capua. They complained about the heat and the boredom and the indignity of hunting slaves when there were real enemies elsewhere. Spartacus saw something else. He saw the cliffs behind the Roman camp, sheer drops that Glaber had dismissed as impassable, natural walls that made fortification unnecessary. He saw the wild grapevines that grew thick across Vesuvius's slopes, vines that could be woven into ropes. The plan was insane. It was also the only option. Under cover of darkness, the gladiators descended the cliff face on improvised rope ladders, lowering themselves hand over hand down rock faces that should have killed them. The footing was treacherous. The vines creaked under weight they were never meant to bear. One slip meant falling silently into the darkness. One cry meant alerting guards who would slaughter everyone still hanging on the cliff. They made it. All of them somehow reached the base of the cliffs behind Glaber's camp. The attack came without warning. Gladiators erupted from darkness that was supposed to be impassable, swords already wet with the blood of sentries who died too surprised to scream. The militia broke immediately. Men trained for civil order, not combat, fled into the night as professional killers cut through their ranks. Glaber barely escaped. His army didn't. The rebels captured weapons, armour, supplies, everything the Romans had brought for their comfortable siege. In a single night, escaped kitchen slaves had defeated a Roman military force. The news reached Rome like a slap, and on Vesuvius, Spartacus looked at the captured weapons and the growing crowd of refugees and understood something terrible. He couldn't stop now. Victory had made retreat impossible. The Senate received the news with irritation, not alarm. Escaped gladiators had defeated a militia force. Embarrassing, certainly. Inconvenient. But Rome had crushed larger slave rebellions before. The Sicilian revolts that burned through the 100s and 100s BCE had killed tens of thousands before Roman legions exterminated them. This Vesuvius incident would end the same way, once proper forces were committed. The problem was that proper forces weren't available. Rome's best legions were deployed against Sertorius in Spain and Mithridates in the east, fighting actual wars against actual enemies. Escaped slaves didn't merit that level of response. The Senate dispatched another praetor, Publius Varinius, with additional militia forces and orders to end this nonsense quickly. Varinius brought overconfidence and contempt. His troops reflected both. The campaign that followed demonstrated everything wrong with Rome's initial response. Varinius split his forces, sending subordinates to engage the rebels in separate actions, while he established a command post. The strategy assumed the slaves would scatter when confronted by Roman military organization, the same assumption that had killed Glaber's men. Spartacus had spent the week since Vesuvius training his growing army. The gladiators taught what they knew: formations, weapon handling, the psychological tricks that turned individuals into units. 3,000 untrained refugees became something approaching soldiers, not legionaries certainly, but no longer a mob. The first clash came when Varinius's subordinate Furius led 2,000 men against what he believed was a disorganized slave camp. The rebels met him in formation. The fighting lasted less than an hour. Furius escaped with a fraction of his force. The rest stayed on the field, their weapons now arming the rebellion's newest recruits. Varinius's other subordinate Cassinius fared worse. The sources describe Spartacus personally leading the attack on Cassinius's camp, catching the Roman commander bathing, literally unarmoured and unprepared. Cassinius died in the assault. His men died around him. The rebels captured his horses, his standards, his personal equipment. Historians still debate whether Spartacus planned these ambushes through intelligence gathering or stumbled into vulnerable Roman positions through luck. The ancient sources suggest a combination. The rebels had developed networks among the slave populations that provided information about Roman movements, while Roman contempt created opportunities that no amount of intelligence could have manufactured. Varinius himself finally engaged the rebel main force near the town of Cumae. The battle should have restored Roman honour. It didn't. The slaves fought in formations, used captured Roman equipment, executed maneuvers that shocked commanders expecting an undisciplined mob. Verinius's militia broke. He fled the field, leaving behind his horse, his lictors, and his military credibility. The praetor who was supposed to crush the rebellion had been stripped of everything that marked him as a Roman commander. His standards were now trophies in a slave camp. The news hit Rome like a physical blow. 2 praetors humiliated, multiple engagements lost, an army of escaped property now controlling significant territory in Campania. The Senate could no longer pretend this was a minor police action, but the rebellion's success created its own poisons. 3,000 had become 30,000. The victories attracted runaways from across southern Italy, field slaves, urban slaves, household slaves, anyone willing to risk crucifixion for the chance to join something that was winning. The logistics of feeding and organising this mass strained everything Spartacus had built. Discipline eroded as the original gladiator corps was diluted by newcomers with no training and incompatible agendas, and the leadership began to fracture. Crixus had been with Spartacus from the kitchen in Capua. The Gallic warrior had fought in every engagement, his massive frame and berserker courage inspiring men who needed inspiration. But Crixus wanted something different from Spartacus. He wanted revenge. The arguments began after the defeat of Verinius. Spartacus counselled continued movement, north, toward the Alps, toward the possibility of escape from Roman territory entirely. The rebels could disappear into Gaul or Thrace, could scatter into regions Rome didn't fully control, could trade rebellion for survival. Crixus rejected this vision. Why run? They were winning. Roman blood stained the ground across Campania. Every victory brought more weapons, more recruits, more proof that the Republic could be hurt. Crixus wanted to keep hurting it until there was nothing left to hurt. The tension wouldn't surface publicly for months, but it was already there, corroding the unity that had made victories possible. Spartacus the strategist and Crixus the avenger needed each other. They also couldn't agree on what they were fighting for, and Rome, finally taking the threat seriously, was about to send something far worse than praetors and militia. 70,000. That number appears in the ancient sources, though modern historians treat it with appropriate skepticism. Whether 70,000 or 50,000 or some other count lost to time, the rebel army had become something unprecedented. The largest servile uprising in Roman history, controlling territory across multiple provinces, defeating Roman military forces repeatedly, humiliating a republic that believed itself invincible. And Spartacus was drowning in his own success. The original gladiators, the 70 men who'd escaped Capua with kitchen knives, now commanded an organism they barely controlled. Every slave in the southern Italy seemed to be flowing toward the rebellion. Field workers abandoned estates. Domestic servants poisoned masters and fled. Workshop labourers walked away from forges still hot with unfinished work. They came without weapons, without training, without understanding of what they were joining. They came because the alternative was spending their lives as property. Spartacus faced logistical nightmares that would challenge a professional army. 70,000 people needed food, not tomorrow, not next week, but today, and every day following. The rebellion had no supply lines, no grain reserves, no agreements with friendly territories. They ate what they could raid from Roman settlements, what they could steal from the farms they passed, what they could scavenge from a countryside that was rapidly being stripped clean. The foraging became increasingly violent. Bands of rebels roamed the landscape taking whatever they needed from whoever had it. Roman citizens, Italian peasants, travellers on the roads, anyone with food became a target. The discipline that had characterised the early victories deteriorated into something closer to organised banditry. Spartacus tried to maintain control. The sources credit him with attempts to prohibit looting, to establish rules for the distribution of captured goods, to preserve something like military hierarchy amid the chaos. These efforts met with mixed success. The gladiator corps followed his commands. The masses of newcomers followed hunger. Worse than logistics was the question no one could answer. What were they fighting for? Historians still debate whether Spartacus had coherent political goals beyond survival. Some ancient accounts suggest he wanted to march north, cross the Alps, and dispersed the rebellion into Gaul and Thrace, returning the slaves to their homelands beyond Rome's reach. Others describe a leader improvising from crisis to crisis, his strategy shaped more by circumstances than by vision. The rebels themselves wanted different things. Spartacus's Thracian followers dreamed of home. Crixus and the Gauls wanted Roman blood in quantities that would satisfy generations of grievance. Former household slaves sought personal vengeance against specific masters. Recent runaways wanted only to survive until tomorrow. The coalition held together through momentum and the absence of alternatives, not through shared purpose. This fragmentation expressed itself in violence. As the army moved through southern Italy, reports accumulated of massacres, rapes, and destructions that served no strategic purpose. Roman prisoners were tortured in ways that echoed the arena spectacles they'd once paid to watch. Captured slaveholders were forced to fight each other for rebel entertainment, a bitter inversion of gladiatorial games that the sources describe with evident horror. Villages that resisted were burned. Villages that didn't were sometimes burned anyway. Spartacus couldn't stop all of it. He may not have tried to stop all of it. The men he led had emerged from conditions designed to break human beings, and their rage found expression in ways that made strategic alliance with anyone impossible. Every atrocity committed by escaped slaves hardened Roman resolve and eliminated any possibility of negotiated settlement. Not that Rome would have negotiated anyway, but the violence ensured that the only possible outcome was total victory or total annihilation. The leadership fracture deepened through the winter of 73 to 72 BCE. Crixus openly argued for remaining in Italy, for building the rebellion into a permanent presence that could bleed Rome for years. Spartacus continued pushing for northern movement, for escape while escape remained possible. Their followers increasingly sorted themselves by nationality and allegiance, Gauls clustering around Crixus, Thracians and Germans around Spartacus. The army that had stunned Rome began resembling two armies that happened to march together. By spring, the break became official. Crixus took 30,000 Gauls and Germans and separated from the main force, establishing his own camp, pursuing his own campaign of vengeance independent of Spartacus's strategy. The sources don't record the final conversation between the two men who'd escaped Capua together. They record only the separation and what it cost. Because Rome had finally stopped sending praetors. Rome was sending consuls now, the highest military commanders the Republic could field, leading the best soldiers available. The time for easy victories was over. The time for dying was about to begin. Spring came to Italy carrying the sound of Roman boots. The Senate had finally committed serious resources. Both consuls for 72 BCE, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, received commands against the rebellion. 2 consular armies meant 4 legions, perhaps 20,000 professional soldiers, plus auxiliary forces drawn from Italian allies. This wasn't a militia response. This was Rome acknowledging that escaped slaves had become an existential threat. The consuls developed a strategy of encirclement. Gellius would strike south, engaging whatever rebel forces he could find while blocking escape towards Sicily. Lentulus would move north, positioning his legions to intercept Spartacus if the rebels tried for the Alps. Between them, the slave army would be ground to pieces. The first victim was Crixus. The Gallic commander had made his camp near Mount Garganus in Apulia, 30,000 fighters drunk on months of successful raiding. They'd collected plunder from across southern Italy, gold, weapons, food, livestock, prisoners whose fates don't bear describing. Crixus believed his position unassailable. He was wrong. Gellius's legions caught the Gauls unprepared. The battle was brief and catastrophic. Professional Roman infantry in formation cut through rebel forces that had forgotten the discipline required to fight organised armies. Crixus died on the field. The sources don't record how, just that his body was never recovered for proper burial. 2/3 of his army died with him, or were captured for later crucifixion. The news reached Spartacus within days. His oldest ally, the man who'd stood beside him in Batiatus's Ludus, who'd fought through the kitchen escape and the cliffs of Vesuvius and every engagement since, gone. 30,000 fighters who'd refused to follow Spartacus's northern strategy, gone. Historians still debate whether Spartacus mourned or calculated. The ancient sources describe funeral games held in Crixus's honour, Roman prisoners forced to fight to the death as gladiators, the same fate the rebellion's leaders had escaped. 300 Romans reportedly died in these games. Whether this was grief expressing itself through violence or cold psychological warfare designed to terrify future opponents, the sources don't say. What matters is what came next. Spartacus should have been finished. His army had divided. The stronger faction had been destroyed. 2 consular armies were closing on his remaining forces from opposite directions. Every principle of military strategy said the rebellion ended here, trapped between hammer and anvil, overwhelmed by professional soldiers who outnumbered his depleted ranks. Spartacus attacked. He struck Lentulus first, catching the northern consul's legions before they could unite with Gellius's victorious force. The battle demonstrated everything the rebellion had learned about Roman warfare. Hit fast, hit hard, disappear before reinforcements arrived. Lentulus's army scattered. The consul himself barely escaped capture. Then Spartacus turned south and engaged Gellius. The consul who had just destroyed Crixus found himself facing an enemy that fought with nothing to lose. The rebels broke his formations. More Roman standards fell into slave hands. Gellius retreated to regroup with forces that needed extensive regrouping. In the span of weeks, Spartacus had defeated both consular armies, the highest military authority Rome could deploy without declaring a state of emergency. No enemy in Roman history had accomplished this. Hannibal had won individual battles but never consecutively humiliated both consuls in the same campaign. The way north stood open, the Alps beckoned. Beyond them lay Gaul, lay Thrace, lay freedom from the republic that would never stop hunting them. Spartacus's original strategy had been vindicated. All he had to do was march. His army refused. The sources describe arguments, near mutinies, commanders who had witnessed the victories and now demanded to continue winning. Why flee to barbarian lands when Italy lay bleeding? Why abandon the plunder they'd accumulated? Why stop when Rome clearly couldn't stop them? Spartacus faced 60,000 fighters who believed themselves invincible because they didn't understand what invincibility cost. He could order a northern march and watch his army melt away to pursue private vengeance. He could stay in Italy and fight battles that would never end until everyone was dead. He chose to stay. The sources don't explain his reasoning. Perhaps he calculated that a divided army would be destroyed piecemeal, as Crixus had been. Perhaps he believed he could still win something meaningful, a negotiated settlement, recognition of rights, some alternative to extinction. Perhaps he simply couldn't abandon the people who'd followed him this far. The decision sealed his fate and theirs. Rome, shaken by consecutive consular defeats, turned to the only solution remaining for problems this serious. They hired Marcus Licinius Crassus, and everything changed. The richest man in Rome wanted a war. Marcus Licinius Crassus had accumulated his fortune through methods that Romans found distasteful, but couldn't argue with. He bought the confiscated properties of civil war victims at auction prices no one dared contest. He ran fire brigades that arrived at burning buildings and negotiated purchase prices while the flames spread. He invested in mines, in trade, in anything that could be converted to profit. His wealth was estimated at 7,000 talents, enough to fund a private army, which is essentially what he did. Crassus needed military glory. In Rome's political system, military achievement translated directly into power, and Crassus had none. His rivals, Pompey conquering Spain, Lucullus fighting Mithridates, were accumulating the victories that would dominate Roman politics for decades. Crassus had only money. The slave revolt offered something priceless, a war no one else wanted. The Senate granted him command of 8 legions and special proconsular authority. The legions included the survivors of the consular disasters, demoralized men who had fled from slaves. Crassus began his command by demonstrating exactly what kind of leader he intended to be. One legion had broken and retreated during an early engagement with Spartacus's forces. Crassus ordered decimation. The practice was ancient and almost never used. The condemned legion was divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The man who drew the short lot was beaten to death by his 9 companions. 500 Roman soldiers died under the clubs and stones of their own comrades, killed not by the enemy but by their commander's judgment that cowardice was worse than death. The survivors watched. Every man in Crassus's 8 legions watched. Historians still debate whether decimation was necessary or merely theatrical. The ancient sources present it as effective. The legions that witnessed the punishment fought with desperate courage in subsequent battles, more afraid of Crassus than of slaves. Modern analysis suggests the psychological trauma may have been counterproductive, creating soldiers who fought from terror rather than discipline. Either way, the message was clear. Retreat meant death. Advance meant possible death. Only victory offered survival. Crassus transformed his campaign into a methodical grinding operation. He didn't seek decisive battle. He pushed the rebels south, kilometre by kilometre, cutting off escape routes and supply sources. Where previous commanders had underestimated Spartacus, Crassus overcompensated, treating the slave army like a professional force, refusing engagement unless conditions overwhelmingly favoured Rome. The rebels found themselves being herded. Spartacus recognised the strategy and tried to break free, launching probing attacks against Crassus's lines, seeking weaknesses that didn't exist. The Roman commander had learned from the disasters that preceded him. He kept his legions concentrated, his flanks secured, his supply lines protected. By autumn of 72 BCE, Spartacus was trapped in the toe of Italy, the peninsula of Bruttium, with the Strait of Messina at his back and Crassus's legions blocking every route north. Escape to Sicily beckoned. The island had hosted massive slave revolts twice before, rebels who seized cities and held territory for years before Roman suppression. If Spartacus could cross the strait, he might reignite those old rebellions, might find defensible positions the legions would take years to breach, might survive long enough for Rome to face other crises. He negotiated with Cilician pirates. The seafaring raiders agreed to provide transport ships in exchange for payment from the rebellion's accumulated plunder. The deal was struck. Ships were promised. Spartacus moved his army to the coastal embarkation points. The pirates never came. The sources don't explain why. Perhaps Rome bribed them more than Spartacus could pay. Perhaps they never intended to honour the agreement. Perhaps weather or Roman naval patrols made the crossing impossible. The reasons matter less than the result. 60,000 rebels waited on beaches for rescue that wasn't coming. Crassus moved to seal the trap permanently. His engineers began constructing a fortification across the narrowest point of the Bruttium Peninsula, a wall and ditch stretching from sea to sea, 55 kilometres long, designed to starve the rebellion into submission. The construction took weeks. Spartacus watched from his side of the growing barrier as Roman engineering transformed geography into prison. Every day the wall grew higher. Every day his food supplies diminished. Every day more of his fighters slipped away, surrendering to Crassus's camps or simply disappearing into the Italian countryside to take their chances alone. The rebellion that had defeated 2 consuls was dying by inches behind a ditch. Winter came, the rain started, and Spartacus understood that waiting meant extinction. The wall was killing them slowly. Crassus's fortification stretched across the Bruttium Peninsula like a scar. Ditch 15 feet deep, rampart reinforced with sharpened stakes, watchtowers at regular intervals manned by legionaries who had learned to fear retreat more than death. Beyond it, 8 legions waited in camps that grew more comfortable while the rebels grew weaker. Spartacus watched his army shrivel. Food supplies that had seemed adequate for weeks were exhausted in days. Foraging parties returned empty-handed from countryside already stripped clean. The horses went first, butchered for meat that wouldn't last, then the remaining livestock, then whatever roots and bark the Bruttium forest could provide. Men began slipping away, at first dozens, then hundreds, creeping toward Roman lines in the darkness to surrender and beg for mercy they wouldn't receive. Crassus crucified the deserters within sight of the rebel camp. It didn't stop the desertions. Slow death by starvation competed against immediate death by crucifixion, and some men chose the quicker end. The cold made everything worse. Winter rains turned the rebel encampment into a swamp of mud and human misery. Wounded men who might have recovered in decent conditions died of infections. Healthy men weakened until wounds found them. The army that had terrorized Italy was dissolving into a mass of skeletal figures too exhausted to fight and too trapped to flee. Spartacus understood that waiting meant watching his army die. He chose action instead. The breakout came on a night when snow drove the Roman sentries into shelter. Spartacus had spent weeks identifying the weakest point in Crassus's wall, a section where the ditch was shallower, where the rampart had been hastily constructed, where tired engineers had cut corners that might make the difference between death and survival. His plan required sacrifice. The rebels gathered materials, tree branches, fascines, anything that could fill a ditch, and the bodies. The sources record this detail with the horror it deserves. Spartacus ordered the corpses of dead prisoners and his own fallen fighters thrown into the fortification's trench, filling it with human flesh so the living could cross. The assault began at midnight. Rebels surged toward the wall carrying bundles of sticks and the dead on their shoulders. Roman sentries emerged from shelter to find thousands of figures materializing from the snow-blind darkness. The fighting at the rampart was brutal and brief. Gladiators who had nothing left to lose against legionaries who had everything to fear from their own commander. The rebels broke through. Not all of them. Historians still debate what fraction of Spartacus's army survived the breakout. Perhaps a third, perhaps less. The rest died at the wall, or were too weak to make the crossing, or simply vanished into the chaos of a nighttime battle fought in blinding snow, but enough made it through to reconstitute something resembling a fighting force. They emerged into Roman Italy again, behind Crassus's carefully constructed trap, with nothing between them and the open country except the legions now scrambling to respond to a disaster their commander had assured them was impossible. Crassus's decimated soldiers had finally encountered something scarier than their general. Escaped slaves who had just proven the wall couldn't hold them. The weeks following the breakout were the rebellion's last flicker of possibility. Spartacus moved fast, heading north, trying to outpace the pursuit he knew was coming. His army was depleted, exhausted, stripped of supplies, but it was moving, which was more than the wall had allowed. New problems emerged immediately. The breakout had shattered what remained of rebel unity. Commanders who had followed Spartacus through the wall began pursuing independent agendas, leading their followers toward different objectives, breaking the concentration that made the army effective. Castus and Gannicus, leaders whose names survived in the sources, took 30,000 fighters and separated from Spartacus's main force. It was Crixus again, repeated in worse circumstances. Crassus caught Castus and Gannicus within weeks. The battle was a massacre. 30,000 rebels died or scattered. More captured standards fell to legions that had learned how to fight these enemies, more Roman confidence restored, and Spartacus, still moving north with his remaining forces, received news that ended everything. Pompey was coming. The general who had just conquered Spain was marching south with battle-hardened legions, summoned by a senate that no longer trusted Crassus to finish the job alone. Lucullus was returning from the east with additional forces. The rebellion that had once faced militia and praetors would now face Rome's best commanders with the Republic's best armies. The mathematics were final. There was nowhere left to run. Spartacus turned south. Every strategic principle demanded northern movement. Pompey's legions were marching from that direction. Fresh troops, undefeated, commanded by Rome's most celebrated general. The Alps still offered theoretical escape, if the rebels could somehow slip between the closing forces. Logic said, run north, take the chance, die trying for freedom rather than certainly dying in southern Italy. Spartacus's army refused. Again. The survivors of the breakout were finished with running. They had crossed Crassus's wall through a ditch filled with their own dead. They had watched 30,000 comrades slaughtered in the weeks after. They were hungry, wounded, exhausted in ways that sleep couldn't repair, and they wanted to fight. Not strategically, not with purpose. They wanted to hurt something Roman before they died. Historians still debate whether Spartacus could have overridden this collective death wish. The sources suggest he tried, argued for the northern escape route, reminded his commanders that survival still remained possible. But leadership in the rebellion had always been consensual. The gladiators followed Spartacus because they chose to, not because military hierarchy compelled them. When they chose otherwise, he had no mechanism to enforce obedience. He stayed with them. Whatever his private calculations, whatever dreams of escape still flickered, he wouldn't abandon the men who'd followed him from Capua's kitchen. They would die together, in a battle none of them could win, because the alternative, survival through desertion, was something Spartacus apparently couldn't accept. The final march covered territory the rebellion had traversed before, in the days when victory seemed possible. Now the landscape was scarred by 2 years of war, burned villages, stripped fields, roads marked by the crucified bodies of earlier surrenderers. The army moved through a country it had helped devastate, toward a confrontation everyone understood would be terminal. Crassus followed at a careful distance. The Roman commander had learned caution from the breakout disaster. He wouldn't give Spartacus another opportunity for desperate gambles. He kept his legions concentrated, his flanks secured, his supply lines maintained. Time favoured Rome. Every day the rebels grew weaker. Every day Pompey drew closer. The psychological atmosphere in the rebel camp defied simple description. These were men who had tasted freedom after years of bondage, who had defeated Roman armies and humiliated Roman commanders, who had lived for 2 years as something other than property. Now they marched toward extermination, knowing that capture meant crucifixion, and that escape had become impossible. Some deserted. The sources record a steady hemorrhage of fighters slipping away into the countryside, hoping to disappear into the general population, to pass as free Italians who'd never been part of the rebellion. Most were caught. Roman authorities had developed efficient systems for identifying runaways, brand marks, accent checks, interrogation of suspicious travellers. The fugitives decorated the roadsides. Those who remained did so from loyalty or hatred, or the simple inability to imagine any other choice. They had burned every bridge that might have led back to slavery. Their only remaining option was to make their deaths expensive. Spartacus made preparations for the battle he knew was coming. He established a position in Lucania, in the southern highlands that had witnessed earlier rebel victories. The terrain offered defensive advantages, hills that channeled attackers, ground that favoured infantry over cavalry. If the rebellion had to die, it would die on land it had chosen. The night before the final battle, Spartacus reportedly killed his horse. The sources present this as a symbolic gesture. Victory would provide Roman horses and defeat would make escape irrelevant. He would fight on foot like the gladiator he'd been, alongside the men he'd led for 2 years. According to Plutarch, he announced to his followers that if they won, they would have many fine horses from the enemy, and if they lost, he wouldn't need one. The joke, if it was a joke, contained the exhaustion of a man who had run out of alternatives. Spartacus had tried escape and been overruled. He had tried strategy and been betrayed by pirates. He had tried unity and watched it fracture repeatedly. Everything he'd attempted had failed except the fighting itself, and now only fighting remained. Dawn came cold and clear. The rebel army formed on the heights. Below, Crassus's legions assembled in formations that stretched across the valley floor. 30,000 professional soldiers facing perhaps 40,000 rebels, the numbers finally favouring Rome decisively. Spartacus looked down at the army that would kill him and chose his final objective. He would try to reach Crassus personally, cut through the Roman lines, find the commander, end this war by ending the man who led it. It was a gladiator's approach to battle, single combat determining outcomes, the arena logic that had shaped his entire fighting life. It wouldn't work. He probably knew it wouldn't work. He attacked anyway. The final battle lasted hours. The rebel charge began at dawn, streaming down the hillsides toward Roman lines that bristled with pila and waited in disciplined silence. The legions had learned not to underestimate these enemies. They received the attack in formation, shields locked, short swords ready for the close work that would decide everything. Spartacus fought at the front of his army. The sources are emphatic about this. He led from the position of greatest danger, cutting through Roman ranks with the skills that had kept him alive in the arena and through 2 years of campaign. He killed 2 centurions who tried to stop his advance. He kept pushing toward the Roman command group, toward Crassus himself, through a press of bodies that thickened with every step forward. He never reached his objective. The details of Spartacus's death were never recovered with certainty. The battle dissolved into the chaos that ancient combat always became. Isolated struggles scattered across the valley floor, formations fragmenting and reforming, men fighting in clusters of desperate violence until one side or the other broke completely. A Roman cavalry charge found Spartacus somewhere in the confusion. His horse was already dead. He'd killed it himself the night before. Foot soldiers against mounted troops had only one possible outcome. Spartacus went down fighting, according to accounts that reached historians generations later, surrounded by the bodies of enemies he'd killed before they killed him. His body was never identified. The battlefield held too many dead, too much carnage for anyone to recover a single corpse from the mass. Roman authorities searched for him afterward, wanting the propaganda value of displaying the rebel leader's remains. They found nothing. Spartacus had disappeared into the slaughter he'd led, as anonymous in death as the thousands who died beside him. The battle ended with the rebels' collapse. 40,000 fighters against 30,000 Romans, with desperation facing discipline, the mathematics finally resolved in Rome's favour. Survivors scattered into the surrounding countryside, fleeing in groups that Crassus's cavalry hunted down over the following weeks. 6,000 were captured alive. Crassus knew exactly what to do with them. The Appian Way stretched from Rome to Capua, the same road Spartacus's gladiators had travelled as slaves, the same road Roman legions used to march south for campaigns. It was the most visible highway in Italy, a testament to Roman engineering and Roman power. Crassus lined it with crosses. 6,000 rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, one every 30 metres for nearly 200 kilometres. The logistics of this execution required weeks of construction. Teams of soldiers building wooden crosses, teams of executioners nailing men to them, teams of guards ensuring the condemned stayed alive long enough for the display to achieve its purpose. Crucifixion killed slowly, days sometimes, depending on how the body was positioned. The condemned hung from nailed wrists and pushed against nailed feet, fighting to breathe against the weight of their own collapsing chests. Dehydration took some, shock took others. Birds found them eventually pecking at flesh too weak to resist. For 200 kilometres, the most trafficked road in the Roman world displayed what happened to slaves who forgot their place. The crosses stayed up for years. Roman law required that crucified bodies remain displayed until they rotted away. A final desecration that denied even the dignity of burial. Travellers on the Appian Way passed skeletal remnants for a generation, bones weathering to white under Italian sun, a monument to the price of rebellion. Historians still debate whether this display achieved its intended purpose. The slave system continued operating. The Roman economy depended too deeply on unfree labour to abandon it for moral qualms. But the crucifixions also demonstrated how seriously the Republic took the threat. 6,000 deaths to prove a point about property rights. Crassus barely had time to enjoy his victory. Pompey's legions arrived in Italy days after the final battle, mopping up survivors that Crassus's forces had missed. Pompey claimed credit for ending the slave war in official communications to the Senate. He celebrated a triumph, the formal victory parade reserved for conquering generals, while Crassus received only an ovation, the lesser honour appropriate for defeating mere slaves. The richest man in Rome had bought his war, had decimated his own soldiers, had crucified 6,000 captives along the Republic's most famous highway. His reward was watching his rival take the glory. The rebellion was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Spartacus's body was never found. This fact haunted Roman authorities for decades. The rebel leader who had humiliated praetors and consuls, who had threatened the foundations of Roman society, had disappeared into the anonymous mass of battlefield dead. No corpse to display, no head to mount on the rostra, no physical proof that the slave who had terrorized Italy was truly, permanently gone. His name vanished from official records with deliberate thoroughness. Roman historians writing about the period referred to the Slave War, or the Gladiator uprising, when they mentioned the rebellion at all. Spartacus became a gap in the documentation, a figure too dangerous to commemorate, too significant to ignore entirely, existing in a grey zone of official memory that acknowledged something terrible had happened, while refusing to specify exactly who had caused it. The republic that survived him continued as if the rebellion had been an aberration, a temporary malfunction in a system that otherwise worked perfectly. Slaves returned to their labours on estates and in households across Italy. Economy resumed its dependence on human property. The 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way rotted slowly into monuments that eventually required no explanation. Everyone knew what they meant. But the wound wouldn't close. Historians still debate whether Spartacus's revolt changed Roman policy towards slaves, or merely revealed attitudes that already existed. The evidence suggests both. Slaveholders became more cautious about concentrating trained fighters. Gladiator schools received stricter regulations, their populations monitored more closely. Agricultural slaves found themselves chained at night in a gastula, underground barracks designed to prevent the kind of nocturnal organising that had preceded the revolt. The paranoia that had always characterised the master-slave relationship intensified into something closer to institutionalised terror. The psychological impact on Roman society defied easy measurement. For 2 years, escaped property had controlled significant portions of Italian territory. They had defeated Roman military forces repeatedly. They had demonstrated that the foundation of Roman prosperity, the assumption that slaves would remain passive because they had no choice, was dangerously unstable. Roman literature from subsequent generations reveals the anxiety. Slave characters in plays and poems became more threatening, their potential for violence acknowledged in ways earlier works had avoided. Legal scholars debated the proper response to slave conspiracies with urgency that suggested the question wasn't theoretical. The nightmare of servile rebellion entered Roman consciousness as a permanent possibility, a disaster that had happened once and could happen again. Crassus, the man who crushed the rebellion, discovered that victory over slaves brought limited credit. His decimation of Roman soldiers alienated the army. His crucifixion display impressed without inspiring affection. His political career required continued military achievement to compete with rivals like Pompey and the rising Julius Caesar. He found that achievement in the east, leading legions against Parthia in 53 BCE. The campaign ended at Carrhae, where Parthian cavalry surrounded and annihilated his army. Crassus was killed during surrender negotiations. His head was reportedly used as a prop in a theatrical performance at the Parthian court. The richest man in Rome died far from home, his body desecrated by enemies who cared nothing for his wealth. The republic he'd served collapsed within a generation. Civil wars tore the Roman state apart as ambitious generals competed for supreme power. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey fled to Egypt and assassination. The constitutional system that had governed Rome for centuries gave way to the autocracy of the emperors. Historians have drawn connections between the slave revolt and the republic's dissolution. The military commands granted to suppress Spartacus, the special proconsular authorities, the concentration of legions under individual generals, established precedents that later commanders exploited for their own purposes. The mechanisms created to defeat escaped slaves helped enable the destruction of the state that created them. Spartacus would have appreciated the irony had he lived to see it. Instead, he achieved something stranger than survival. He became a symbol that outlasted the civilization he had fought. Centuries after Rome itself had fallen, his name resurfaced in context he couldn't have imagined. Revolutionary movements in 18th century Europe, Marxist analysis of class struggle, Hollywood spectacles that transformed a Thracian gladiator into an icon of human resistance against oppression. The Republic erased him from its records. History wrote him back. His army scattered into death and slavery on a valley floor in Lucania. His followers decorated crosses along the Appian Way until their bones crumbled to dust. His cause, whatever he'd believed it to be, failed absolutely. leaving nothing but traumatic memory in the civilization he'd challenged. But his name survived. The Roman state that had classified him as property, that had trained him to die entertainingly, that had crucified 6,000 of his followers as warnings against future rebellion, that state dissolved into the chaos of civil war and the transformation of empire. Emperors rose and fell. The slave system continued for centuries before slowly giving way to different forms of exploitation. Eventually, Rome itself became a relic, its roads and aqueducts tourist attractions, its legions material for entertainment. Spartacus remained. Not as a person. He had ceased being a person on that battlefield in Lucania, if not long before, in the ludus that had broken him into a weapon. He remained as an idea, as a name that meant something beyond the specific events of 73 to 71 BCE. He meant that the powerful could be challenged. He meant that the enslaved could fight back. He meant that systems designed to be permanent could be wounded by those they consumed. The wound never fully healed. Spartacus died in a battle he couldn't win, leading men who'd refused the escape route that might have saved them. His body disappeared into a mass grave of anonymous rebels. His followers rotted on crosses along the Republic's most famous highway. The empire that killed him endured for centuries, and then it didn't. History remembers the victory. It forgot the price, except for the name of a Thracian slave who was supposed to die for Roman entertainment and chose a different kind of death instead. The crosses came down eventually. The roads crumbled, the legions disbanded, and the name remained.